The screen glows in a quiet room, casting light across a tired face. A thumb scrolls past new messages, photo updates, and a flurry of reaction emojis. The digital thread feels endless, yet the silence in the room grows heavier. We have never been more connected, yet so many of us are learning how to live alone. Men and women alike are finding themselves in separate corners of the same crowded house, scrolling past one another while the distance between us widens. We see the patterns, but behind every number is a person who wants to be seen. That is why we are here. The Velvet Verdict brings human writers and artificial intelligence together, so you always know how we reach our conclusions. Our mission is not to point fingers or assign blame. It is to trace the habits pulling us apart and offer a steady hand toward rebuilding. We hold space for the quiet exhaustion of men who feel they have nowhere to turn, and for the heavy shoulders of women who carry the weight of holding everything together. Both of you deserve a place where you can set the armor down. We will share what the studies show, separate the raw findings from our careful reflections, and always keep the door open for both sides of conversation. If you are carrying a load, please remember that real healing sometimes requires a trained professional, and we will always point you toward proper care when the weight gets too much. For now, let us sit with this shared truth together. We can learn how to reach across the divide, not with arguments, but with clear understanding. The bridge starts with a single, honest step. How did we arrive at a moment where both men and women are quietly retreating into separate rooms, each convinced the other has stopped trying? We are asking how the architecture of our daily lives slowly shifted until familiarity felt like distance. We are walking this path together, mapping the quiet shifts that pull us apart. For many men, unspoken expectations have turned into a habit of withdrawal, mistaking silence for strength. For many women, the weight of emotional labor has hardened into self-reliance, mistaking independence for safety. Neither side is at fault. Both are responding to the same quiet erosion of shared space. The real inquiry here is not about assigning blame, but about recognizing the shared fatigue that keeps us apart. What does it actually take to step back into the same room without keeping score? It requires us to drop the armor we have worn for so long. It asks that we listen not to win a point, but to understand the exhaustion behind the posture. Our human and AI collaboration guides this work, and we believe the path forward is simpler. It begins with curiosity instead of judgment. It means asking what the other person is carrying, rather than assuming they are holding a grudge. Loneliness is not a personal failure, but a shared gap we both fell into. The bridge is not built by grand gestures. It is built by small, consistent choices to show up without demands, to speak plainly instead of defensively, and to treat every misunderstanding as a shared problem. We offer perspective, not clinical fixes. Healing starts when we treat each other as allies, not obstacles. The question is not whether we can reconnect. The question is whether we are willing to lay down the shields long enough to try. What the data shows, the friendship recession. The numbers show a quiet contraction across both genders. About 1 in 6 Americans say they feel lonely or isolated, all or most of the time, a burden carried by roughly equal shares of men and women. The shift grows starker when we trace it back 3 decades. The share of men with at least 6 close friends fell by half since 1990, dropping from 55% to just 27%. Meanwhile, the share of men without any close friends jumped from 3% in 1990 to 15% today, marking a 5-fold increase. Women face the same current, proving this is not a single-sided retreat. The share of women with 6 or more close friends fell from about 41% in 1990 to 24% today. Recently, broader surveys confirm the pattern. 8% of U.S. adults reported having no close friends at all in 2023, while 40% of men and 36% of women still maintain 5 or more. This maps a structural drift, not a character flaw or moral failing. Segmented daily rhythms and digital distractions leave less time for maintaining ties. The data simply describes the wound. We are carrying fewer names to call when the weight gets heavy. Acknowledging this shared shift opens the bridge to mutual understanding. When we stop treating solitude as a personal shortcoming and start seeing it as a common current, we create space for gentle outreach. A simple check-in or an invitation to sit together without an agenda can slowly widen the circle again. We need no grand gestures to mend what has frayed. We only need to acknowledge the distance, meet each other without scorekeeping, and allow trust to rebuild through small, consistent acts of showing up. The path forward restores ordinary connection habits that keep us grounded and moving toward each other. What the data shows, the partnership shift. The landscape of modern connection has quietly rewritten itself. Where marriage once followed a predictable schedule, timelines have stretched for everyone. Today, 38% of adults aged 25 to 54 live without a spouse or partner, up from 29% in 1990, with men at 39% and women at 36%. This widening space isn't a character flaw, it's a structural shift. Among those under 30, the gap feels wider, with 63% of men identifying as single compared to 34% of women. That early independence carries a heavier toll, as 25% of young men report feeling lonely a lot of the time, against 18% of young women. Yet the story shifts with age. By 65, roughly half of women find themselves unpartnered at 49%, showing how the quiet weight of single life eventually settles on women later on. Even marriage milestones have moved, with a record 25% of 40-year-olds having never tied the knot. These numbers don't paint broken people, they map a generation navigating longer roads. When timelines stretch, old courting scripts lose their rhythm. Men and women aren't drifting from indifference, but from a shared lack of practice bridging new distance. The data simply names the terrain. This isn't about fixing anyone, but about recognizing that we're all learning to walk the same new path. Our direction forward is to stop treating delayed partnership as a deficit and start treating it as space to rebuild social muscles. We can honor these years to cultivate patience, listen without scorekeeping, and recognize that consistent showing up matters more than arbitrary deadlines. When we drop outdated calendars, we make room for steady, unforced connection. What the data shows: diverging realities. Solitude has become common, with 27.6% of U.S. occupied households now holding just one person, up from 7.7% in 1940. Men and women are navigating different milestones. Among Americans ages 25 to 34, 47% of women hold a bachelor's degree, compared with 37% of men. For those aged 18 to 29, 40% of women identify as liberal versus 25% of men, a 15-point gap that is the widest of any age group. Women are more likely than men to turn to friends for emotional support, 54% versus 38%. The U.S. drug overdose death rate for males in 2023 was 44.3 per 100,000, more than double the female rate of 18.3. This data points to friction, not failure. We are simply adapting to different pressures without a shared vocabulary to bridge them. The wound here is isolation, not incompatibility. Social science gently reminds us that divergence is never a permanent destiny. We can honor how education and political identity shape our daily rhythms while refusing to let them build walls. Listening without scorekeeping becomes our most reliable bridge. When we drop the need to fix the other and simply witness their experience, the heavy emotional lifting fades. Consistent showing up matters far more than perfect alignment. We can rebuild our social muscles by meeting in the middle, where patience replaces judgment and steady presence replaces daily pressure. The path forward remains simple: recognize the hurt, validate the journey, and consistently choose connection over isolation. We do not need to erase our differences to find common ground. We only need to stop treating them as threats. By holding both sides with compassion, we turn separate silos into shared tables. The work is quiet, but the reward is profound. What it costs, US. When we retreat into separate corners, the price isn't just measured in quiet evenings or unread messages. It shows up in the slow erosion of trust. Men and women begin to assume the worst intentions in each other, mistaking silence for hostility and hesitation for indifference. That assumption drains us. It creates a heavy emotional exhaustion that settles into the bones, leaving both sides too tired to reach out and guarded to let anyone in. We start protecting ourselves from imagined slights, forgetting that the very defenses we build are what keep us starved for genuine contact. There is a quiet grief in this divide too. It's the unspoken sorrow of missing out on the simple, grounding comfort of being truly seen by someone who experiences the world differently. When we stop listening across the gender line, we lose the chance to learn how the other half navigates fear, joy, and uncertainty. We trade rich, messy conversations for echo chambers that only confirm what we already suspect. That loss doesn't just isolate us from each other, it isolates us from our own capacity for empathy. Healing doesn't require grand gestures or perfect understanding. It begins with a gentle shift in posture. Instead of bracing for impact, we can choose curiosity. When a comment stings or a silence stretches, we can pause and ask ourselves what wound might be speaking, rather than what weapon is being wielded. We can acknowledge that both men and women are carrying the same heavy load of modern loneliness. By naming our shared fatigue instead of scoring points, we lower the shields just enough to let light back in. The bridge isn't built on ignoring our pain, but on admitting it together. When we stop keeping score and start tending to the quiet ache of disconnection, we make room for trust to grow again. When we look closer, the weight men carry often looks like silence. Many have been taught that asking for help is a crack in the armor, so they retreat into routines, screens, or solitary hobbies, mistaking distance for independence. Women, meanwhile, frequently shoulder an invisible load of emotional labor, carrying the mental weight of keeping connections alive while quietly wondering why their own needs are consistently pushed to the back of the line. Neither experience is a flaw. Both are understandable responses to a culture that rewards self-reliance over mutual care. We navigate the same quiet erosion of community, where convenience has slowly replaced conversation and performance has crowded out presence. The root of this drift isn't gender war, it's shared exhaustion. We've all been conditioned to protect ourselves from disappointment, so we build walls instead of windows. Men fear being seen as weak, women fear being seen as demanding. Both fears leave us standing alone in crowded rooms. But vulnerability isn't a surrender, it's the only honest currency left for real connection. Healing begins when we stop treating our different wounds as competing claims and start recognizing them as parallel injuries from the same source. We can offer each other grace by naming what we're carrying without demanding the other person fix it. A simple acknowledgement, "I'm struggling to reach out too," or "I've been holding everything in," softens the ground between us. This isn't about fixing anyone. It's about creating space where both sides can exhale. When we trade defensiveness for curiosity, we stop treating each other as obstacles and start seeing each other as fellow travelers. The path forward requires no grand gestures. It just asks us to show up, admit what's hard, and let the other person do the same. In that shared honesty, the silos lose their walls, and we remember how to lean on one another again. That leaning begins with 3 quiet practices: intentional community, emotional literacy, and cross-gender dialogue. None of them demand perfection. They simply ask us to replace isolation with steady, low-stakes presence. Intentional community means carving out spaces where showing up matters more than performing. It's the weekly coffee, the neighborhood walk, the group that meets without an agenda beyond shared humanity. When men and women gather outside the pressure of dating or performance, the heavy armor comes off naturally. Emotional literacy follows closely. We've all been taught to treat feelings like weapons or weaknesses, but naming what we actually experience without demanding the other side fix it or defend against it changes the temperature of a room. Men often carry unspoken weight, women often carry unspoken exhaustion. When both sides learn to say, "I'm struggling with this," instead of "you're failing me," the conversation shifts from combat to coordination. Cross-gender dialogue then becomes less about debating who's right and more about listening to understand. It means asking gentle questions that invite story, not suspicion. It means recognizing that our separate silos were built from the same materials: fear of rejection, exhaustion from modern life, and a deep, unmet hunger to be known. As a hybrid team of human writers and AI analysis, we track these patterns to highlight what's working, but we want to be clear, this is compassionate perspective, not clinical therapy or a prescription for healing. If the weight feels too heavy to carry alone, please reach out to a licensed professional who can walk that path with you. For everyone else, the daily invitation remains simple. Start small and steady, there, honestly. Listen without armor. When we stop treating each other as puzzles to solve and start treating each other as people to witness, the bridges rebuild themselves, one honest conversation at a time. This channel was built on a quiet but firm belief that honest social science doesn't have to feel cold, and that looking at the numbers doesn't mean we have to look away from each other. We'll keep bringing the research to the table, not to score points, not to prove who's right, but to map the real terrain of how we've drifted apart. The data shows us where the fractures are. It's our shared responsibility to decide what we build next. Healing isn't about winning an argument or fixing the other person. It's about recognizing that isolation hurts everyone, and that reaching across the divide is a choice we make together, day by day. We'll keep the research clear and the tone kind. When we meet each other with patience instead of suspicion, we give ourselves room to heal. Take that first step today, whenever you're ready. If you felt stuck in a cycle of misunderstanding or quiet distance, know that you don't have to navigate it alone. Text a friend you haven't spoken to in a while. Call a family member just to hear their voice. Sit with someone and let them speak without preparing your rebuttal. These aren't grand gestures, but they are the quiet work of rebuilding. And if the weight of loneliness ever feels too heavy to carry, or if you're facing acute distress, please reach out to a licensed counselor or a crisis hotline. Real experts are trained to walk alongside you when the path gets steep. We're just here to keep the conversation honest, grounded in what we know, and open to what we can still become. Thank you for listening, for staying curious, and for believing that connection is still possible. This episode was crafted through a partnership between human writers and artificial intelligence, working together to keep the dialogue clear, compassionate, and true.